The man known to history as Richard II was born on the 6th of January 1367 at the Archbishop's Palace in the western French city of Bordeaux, in the English province of Aquitaine. His father was Edward, Prince of Wales, the eldest son and heir designate of King Edward III of England. The prince is more commonly known by his appellation of the Black Prince, a name he most likely acquired from the colour of the armour he often wore. Edward had distinguished himself in fighting for his father's cause in France since he was a teenager, and in some of the most significant battles of the early stages of the 100 Years' War, which Edward III had initiated in 1337 to press his claim to the throne of France. In recognition of his actions in France, Edward III had made his namesake and designated heir the Prince of Aquitaine and Gascony, the core of England's French territories in 1362. It was a result of the Black Prince's long stretches there that Richard was born in western France. As a result of his place of birth, he would subsequently be known as Richard of Bordeaux, until he later became King Richard II. Richard of Bordeaux's mother was Joan, the Countess of Kent. She was the daughter of Edmund of Woodstock, the first Earl of Kent, and was herself the great-granddaughter of King Edward I, Edward III's grandfather. Consequently, the Black Prince, whom she married in 1361 as her third husband, was her cousin. Joan was the older of the pair at 35 years of age, but the union quickly produced two sons, Edward, who was born at Angoulême in the summer of 1364, and Richard, who arrived 2.5 years later. Richard was born into a world and a family which was engaged in an enormous conflict spanning much of Western Europe. In 1337, his grandfather, King Edward III, King of England, ruler of Wales and lord of significant parts of northern and western France, began pressing his claim to the throne of France over that of King Philip VI of the House of Valois, who had been King of France since 1328. Edward's claim led to the outbreak of the conflict which historians have termed the 100 Years' War, a conflict between the Plantagenet kings of England and the Valois kings of France for control of France, though the conflict went through periods of intense activity and relative peace across the 116 years of conflict which actually occurred. In part, this was driven by Edward III already having significant possessions in France, where he ruled over Aquitaine and Gascony in the western parts of the country and other districts in the north, such as the Pale of Calais. Finally, the Plantagenet dominions stretched further to the west across the Irish Sea, where an English lordship had been carved out in the eastern and southern parts of the country during the late 12th, 13th, and early 14th centuries. This Irish inheritance was often neglected, but would have a substantial significance for Richard's later reign. Surprisingly little is known about Richard's earliest years, and the details of how he was educated and raised during his infancy and early childhood years are largely a mystery. Although we do know that Sir Simon de Burghley, a friend of the Black Prince, tutored Richard for some time. If this period in Richard's life is somewhat shadowy, it is because the chroniclers of the time were understandably more concerned with examining the tortuous politics of these years and their implications for the future king. The first such development occurred in the winter of 1370, when Richard was still shy of his 4th birthday. At this time, his older brother Edward was struck by the bubonic plague, the vicious disease which had arrived to Europe earlier in the century, carried on fleas on the backs of Asiatic rats. The Black Death, as the initial outbreak in the mid-14th century has become known, had quickly killed as much as 1/3 of Europe's people. Now, the young prince, the second in line to the throne after his father, was carried away by it at some unknown date in late 1370, or possibly in January 1371, and this now meant that young Richard was his father's heir and second in line to the throne at a time when the ruling monarch, Edward III, was nearing his 60s and was showing signs of rapidly deteriorating health himself. To compound the succession problems further, Richard's father, the Black Prince, was himself in poor health by the early 1370s. Despite his military prowess, Prince Edward had been sick for some time. This had begun during a military campaign into Spain in 1365 and 1366, just before Richard's birth. Many of Edward's troops had died of dysentery during the campaign, and the prince fell seriously ill himself. At the time, many suspected that he had been poisoned. Whatever the truth of his malady, he never fully recovered from it. As a result, the death of the younger Edward in 1370 placed Richard closer to the throne than it might otherwise have. Then, in June 1376, the Black Prince finally succumbed to his illness. Steps were quickly taken to anoint Richard as the new Prince of Wales and the designated successor of Edward III, and Parliament quickly ratified this, as there was a fear, which was probably unfounded, that Richard's uncle John of Gaunt would move to usurp the throne if Edward III died while Richard was still so young. As a consequence, the so-called Good Parliament of 1376 formally accepted Richard as Edward's successor, so that when the old king died on the 21st of June 1377, 10-year-old Richard succeeded him. A minority government would now be needed. Richard could not rule in his own right as a 10-year-old, and it would be several years before he could begin to exercise the kingship in a meaningful way. Consequently, a council of courtiers and officials was now formed to effectively rule England and the other territories of the realm during Richard's minority. But this minority government was somewhat toothless, as a decision was made to try to limit the power of the king's uncles, a decision which fragmented the government of the realm. 3 of Richard's uncles had survived their father. Of these, John of Gaunt was the most significant. He was born in the Low Countries in 1340, and his name was derived from a corruption of the word Ghent, the town where he was born. He was the oldest of Edward III's surviving sons when Richard ascended to the throne in 1377, and, as such, he had a claim to seniority within the royal family during his nephew's minority. Moreover, he had campaigned extensively on the continent during the course of the 100 Years' War, both in France and Spain, and as such was wholly familiar with military affairs and the tortuous politics of Western Europe in the late 14th century. Beyond John, Edward III's 5th son, Thomas of Woodstock, Earl of Buckingham and future Duke of Gloucester, would also play an important role in future events. Richard was crowned at Westminster Abbey on the 16th of July 1377. There were great hopes for the new king. While Edward III had been one of England's greatest kings and had reaffirmed the English presence in France, the last years of his long reign had seen a number of problems emerge in the realm, and resentment building at large taxes and the domination of the court by a faction surrounding the late king's mistress, Alice Perrers. Consequently, the accession of Richard was greeted as a possibility for a fresh start in England. But these hopes were soon dashed. The heavy taxes which Edward III's administration had been forced to impose in England to pay for the war in France continued in the shape of the poll tax, a tax of 4 pence per person, although it was originally charged in 1377 on only a select group of people in England who could afford it. Additionally, 2 members of the King's Council, Sir Simon de Burghley and Robert de Vere, 9th Earl of Oxford, began to monopolise power into their own hands and clashed with Parliament in such a way that by 1380 the minority councils were largely discontinued. All of this ensured that by the time Richard was entering his teenage years in 1380 and 1381, his regime was already increasingly unpopular, even as Richard began to rule as king himself. Most troubling of all in the late 1370s and early 1380s was that the war effort was faring very badly. It was one thing for England's nobility and wider political community to be heavily taxed at home, but it was doubly troubling to see that those same taxes were enabling nothing but defeat on the continent. Between 1377 and 1380, English arms suffered several defeats against French forces led by the Breton knight and the Constable of France, Bertrand de Guesclin. By the time Du Guesclin and King Charles V of France both died in 1380, the French had prized back most of the lands which Edward III had gained in the country under the terms of the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360, and the English presence was largely confined to Calais and some other port towns. Then, the decision by the French government in Paris to try to tie the Duchy of Brittany to the French crown in 1380 created an opportunity for the English to realign themselves with the duchy, but even this ended in defeat. Richard's uncle, Thomas of Woodstock, led an army to France in 1380 to try to take advantage of this state of affairs, but in the months that followed, the government of Charles VI, the new French king and himself a child like Richard, reconciled with the Bretons, and Thomas consequently found himself stranded in northwest France with an army that was taking heavy casualties. The only saving grace was that the king's uncle was able to secure a payment of 50,000 francs from the Bretons in order to abandon his campaign. Nevertheless, the war effort looked grim during Richard's first years. Given all these problems, it is unsurprising that Richard's early reign is noteworthy for two major instances of civil, social, and religious unrest in England. The first of these concerned the teachings of the theologian and philosopher John Wycliffe, and the following he acquired in the late 1370s and early 1380s. Wycliffe was born at some stage in the 1320s and had attended the University of Oxford in the 1350s before subsequently acquiring a teaching position there and eventually becoming master of Balliol College. Thereafter, he acquired several positions within the church, while also continuing his teaching work periodically. By the last years of the reign of King Edward III, he was engaged in a project to translate the Bible into English from Latin. And by the time Richard ascended to the throne in 1377, he had become a figure of some controversy, as he began to call for a striking series of reforms to be initiated in the English Church. These foreshadowed much of the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century in calling for a removal of ostentation from churches, a closer reading of Scripture in the vernacular languages, and a wariness of residual elements of pagan superstition in popular religious practice. More significantly, he questioned many aspects of church belief, including the power of the papacy in Rome, the relative doctrinal merit of some of the sacraments, and the veneration of the saints. Wycliffe really began to become a problem from a political perspective in England in the first months of Richard's reign. At that time, he published De Civili Dominio, or On Civil Dominion, a work which called for a separation of church and state and which rebuked the power of the papacy in Rome, earning Wycliffe his first official condemnation from Pope Gregory XI. In contrast to the vast riches and power of the Roman Catholic Church, Wycliffe argued that the Church should renounce its wealth and priests should live in poverty. Thereafter, he clashed repeatedly with the church authorities in England and intensified his attacks on the Pope. His doctrinal discussion expanded at this time, and by the end of the 1370s, Wycliffe was questioning the concept of transubstantiation, the idea that Christ is present in the Eucharist. And it was not simply that he was a lone voice. By the early 1380s, Wycliffe had amassed a large following of priests and lay people who believed in his ideas, some within the ranks of government and the court. Today, these are known as the Lollards, though the term was a pejorative one which was applied by opponents of Wycliffe's teachings in subsequent times. As a result of all of this, Wycliffe began to lose the support of many within the church and government, notably over his rejection of transubstantiation. By the early 1380s, England was experiencing considerable unrest owing to Wycliffe's teachings and the response of the church and Richard's government to them. One of the major issues here was the manner in which Wycliffe's teachings essentially argued for a society divested of its traditional hierarchies of state and church, and it was no simple matter to silence him. By 1382, he had amassed a very considerable contingent of followers within government circles, and the English Parliament and Oxford had become the intellectual centre of the Lollard movement in England. Where the movement may have gone in future years, had he lived longer, is a matter of some interest, but Wycliffe was not long for the world. On the 28th of December 1384, he suffered a major stroke and died 3 days later. The movement, which he had spawned, though, continued to be a considerable one within England for the remainder of Richard's reign. Efforts to suppress the Lollards were accordingly being implemented occasionally during the 1380s and 1390s, and indeed well into the 15th century, anti-Wycliffe legislation was still being introduced into England. In time, Wycliffe's teaching influenced the church reform movement on the continent and was a very significant precursor to the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. Wycliffe's movement also played a part in causing the other major social and political crisis of the early part of Richard's reign. The demographic and economic changes which had been caused by the Black Death in the 1340s and 1350s had led to long-lasting tensions between landholders in England and the peasantry. This was exacerbated by Wycliffe's teachings, which appealed to the lower orders and the poor. Then, in 1381, the poll tax, which had previously been imposed only on the more well-off in England, was expanded to be collected from all adults, even the poor, a move which led to widespread unrest and then rebellion. The Peasants' Revolts of 1381 started in Kent and Essex in the early summer when large bands of armed peasants gathered at Blackheath near London. They were led by Wat Tyler, John Ball and Jack Straw. Tyler being a tradesman who had led a contingent of the disaffected from Canterbury towards London, and Ball being a radical preacher who had been imprisoned and who mirrored the egalitarianism of Wycliffe's preaching, albeit while not being an acknowledged follower of Wycliffe's. In the days that followed their congregation at Blackheath, the peasant army murdered the Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury, and the Lord High Treasurer of England, Robert Hales, as well as burning down John of Gaunt's Savoy Palace. A major crisis now ensued across southern England. Richard's government had been caught off guard by the sudden advance of the peasant army under Tyler and Ball towards London. The king was quickly moved to the Tower of London, the central military fortress in late medieval London. Here, the government convened around the 14-year-old king and deliberated on negotiating with the rebels. But this seemed impossible. Their demands were utopian for the time and extended as far as the complete abolition of serfdom, as well as an abandonment of the poll tax and reform of the church. By now, the rebels were effectively swarming around London, and there was little option but for Richard and his councillors to meet with Tyler and his sub-leaders. Meetings occurred at Mile End and Smithfield outside London on the 14th and 15th of June. But the second meeting broke into a confrontation when Tyler refused to show adequate deference in front of the king. A melee broke out, and in the ensuing fighting, Tyler was killed by William Walworth, the Lord Mayor of London. Thereafter, Richard granted clemency to the rebels on condition that they would disperse, a promise which was later revoked. With the rebellion having lost its drive, The king was consequently able to mop up the last elements of unrest in Essex by the end of June 1381. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was a watershed moment in Richard's reign. Prior to this, we know little about the king himself, on either his education, his childhood, or his role, however small it might have been, in ruling England between 1377 and 1381. However, we first begin to see him at the centre of events in the chronicles and histories of the time during the summer of 1381, as he met with Tyler and his associates and campaigned actively in the field. Much of this information for Richard's reign comes from the works of Thomas Wolsingham, a contemporary of these events who was probably born in the mid-14th century. He subsequently became a Benedictine monk and spent much of his life at the monastery of St. Albans Abbey in Hertfordshire. Here, he was in charge of the scriptorium and is believed to have been the author of several key histories of the period, including the Chronica Majora, which details much of the earlier part of Richard's reign during his minority, and the Historia Anglicana, which provided a history of England between 1272 and 1422, the year of Walsingham's own death. Other important sources of information on Richard's reign include the chronicles of Jean Froissart, a contemporary observer of events from France, and the anonymously authored Dieu-Lacre Chronicle, which presents extensive details about Richard's later life. From these authors, we get a relatively coherent picture of the king who began to emerge from boyhood in the 1380s. Almost all contemporaries, even the chroniclers who were generally opposed to Richard's rule, unanimously agreed that Richard was a handsome monarch, standing just over 6 foot tall and with an athletic build. The Wilton diptych, a panel painting from the 1390s, depicts him with reddish hair, and he is known to have sported a beard. He was well-read and keenly intelligent, while his religious views were conservative, and he became implacably opposed to the Lollards later in his reign. But there were other aspects of his personality which were more problematic. As he became older, Richard became increasingly autocratic, with a tendency towards being an absolutist monarch. Long before absolutist monarchy emerged as a prevailing political orthodoxy amongst Europe's royal families in the 16th and 17th centuries. And there were also psychological issues. Richard could behave strangely in his adult years, to the extent that earlier biographers have suggested he may have suffered from schizophrenia, while one of the most in-depth recent studies of his rule concluded that Richard was possessed of what today would be termed a narcissistic personality disorder. The ill effects of these personality defects would, however, not begin to manifest themselves for some time to come. Back in the early 1380s, in the aftermath of the Peasants' Revolt, there were pressing issues. The nation was in a poor state. There was little denying that. The war in France had seen many defeats in recent years. The common people of the country were extremely disaffected owing to high taxation, and there was religious heresy proliferating throughout the country. These issues would take time to amend, but one thing which could be dealt with more easily was the issue of Richard's marriage. By 1381 he was 14, and a wife was being actively sought for the young king so that he could begin siring heirs to continue the royal line. The match that was eventually negotiated was with Anne of Bohemia, the eldest daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor and ruler of Luxembourg and Bohemia, Charles IV. Charles was arguably the most powerful ruler in Europe at the time, and the marriage alliance was formed on the basis that he would ally with England against the French in the years to come. This latter belief, though, proved unfounded, and Charles offered little effective support to Richard on the battlefield in the 1380s and into the 1390s. Richard's marriage to Anne proved problematic in more ways than one. Not only was her father unforthcoming in providing military assistance to England in the years that followed, but the union did not result in children, although Richard and Anne were seemingly very committed to one another. Thus, as the years went by, the king's lack of a male heir would become a major political issue in England. The matter of the king's marriage and lack of children also fed into increasing discontent about the influence of a handful of close advisers of the young king who were deemed to have too much influence over the governing of the realm. Chief amongst these was Michael de la Pole. De la Pole was a member of an English merchant family which had risen to power during the reign of Edward III by acting as the king's chief financier. Sir William de la Pole, Michael's father, had been made the chief baron of the English exchequer under Edward, and now Richard continued this preference for the family by appointing Michael as Lord Chancellor of England in 1383. 2 years later, he ennobled him as the first Earl of Suffolk, but de la Pole had been central to negotiating the marriage alliance with Charles IV, and as the alliance soured in the years ahead, de la Pole increasingly became a lightning rod for discontent within Richard's realms. Resentment at figures such as de la Pole and his influence increasingly coalesced in the mid-1380s around the issue of the war with France. On one side were Richard and his close advisers such as de la Pole and the Earl of Oxford, Robert de Vere, who were aware of the need for financial stringency in order to avoid a repeat of the Peasants' Revolt, as well as the need for heavy taxes, as there could be no sustained large-scale campaign on the continent without them. On the opposite side was a court faction increasingly led by the king's uncles John of Gaunt and Thomas of Woodstock. This loose coalition supported the resumption of large-scale campaigning in France to reinvigorate the war there to how it had been during the glory days of Edward III in the 1340s and 1350s. But they were to be disappointed. In 1385, when a French army landed in Allied Scotland and raids were carried out against northern England, Richard did lead an army into Scotland, accompanied by John of Gaunt, but having reached Edinburgh without engaging the Scots in any meaningful fashion, Richard elected to return home against John's pleas to continue the campaign further north to Fife. No sooner were they all back in England than joint Franco-Scottish raiding parties were attacking south as far as Durham and Carlisle in northern England. These were inauspicious developments. Where Edward III had once threatened Paris, the French were now operating on English soil. 1386 brought a fresh round of crisis for Richard and his government. A deep split had now opened between Richard's advisers and others such as Gaunt and Buckingham. Rumours were even circulating that Gaunt would be murdered. This was partly responsible for John's decision shortly after the Scottish campaign to head for Spain to try and enforce his claim to the throne of the Kingdom of Castile there, which he had inherited through his marriage to Constance of Castile. He would not return to England for over 3 years. In the interim, his brother, Richard's other uncle, Thomas of Woodstock, became the leader of the discontented element in England. These were now increasingly opposed to de la Pole and his running of the government's finances and the handling of the war, most notably because it was widely believed that the only reason the French had not invaded southern England that year was owing to Charles VI being distracted by a revolt in the Low Countries, which drew his forces there instead. As a result, when the so-called Wonderful Parliament convened in the autumn of 1386 and de la Pole made requests for extensive new taxes, the Parliament responded by demanding reform of the government and greater oversight of the Crown's finances in return for agreeing new taxes. The stage was set for a showdown. Richard's initial reaction to this call for additional parliamentary oversight of his administration and its finances in particular was reactionary. At first, he claimed there was no possibility of him entertaining Parliament in this fashion, But when it became clear that the necessary taxes would not be granted to maintain the defence of the kingdom if he did not comply, he reluctantly agreed to allow the establishment of a limited parliamentary commission which could monitor royal expenses and spending for 1 year. Then he began planning his real response. In February 1387, he left London for a long countrywide tour designed to build support for a future confrontation with Parliament. For instance, he installed one of his closest advisers, the Earl of Oxford, Robert de Vere, as overseer of the powerful Palatine county of Chester, and he obtained a legal ruling from the Chief Justice of King's Bench, Sir Robert Tressilian, that the wonderful Parliament's actions had been at least a breach of the law and quite possibly treasonous. Others, such as the Mayor of London, Nicholas Brombre, and ecclesiastical figures such as the Archbishop of York, Alexander Neville, were also prepared for the coming confrontation. Richard finally returned to London in November 1387 after an 8-month absence, but his return did not go according to plan. No sooner had he reached the capital than the heads of the opposition within the government and Parliament confronted him. These were led by Thomas of Woodstock, who by this time had been elevated to the title of Duke of Gloucester, but the party went further than expected and presented claims of treason against a number of Richard's closest supporters, specifically de la Pole, de Vere, and Tressilian. Then, although Richard attempted to stall for time, his position was made impossible when Gloucester was joined by several other peers known to posterity as the Lords Appellant, chief amongst whom was the Earl of Derby, Henry Bolingbroke. Bolingbroke was John of Gaunt's eldest son and had stepped into the world created by his father's departure for Spain. When he combined with Gloucester, Richard's uncle, in late 1387, it presented too unified an opposition for the king to ignore them. In the weeks that followed, de Vere and de la Pole were forced to flee from England, and in the new merciless Parliament of 1388, they were sentenced to death in absentia, while Tressilian and several of Richard's other supporters were tried and executed in the months that followed. Thus, by 1388, the king had been severely humbled by a faction of his own family members and senior nobles who now exercised great control over the country. Eventually, the furore from the crisis of the wonderful Parliament and the Lords Appellant would abate, and Richard was able to re-establish his power as king as he entered his adult years. This quick about-face was in large part because the Lords Appellant were unable to follow through on the ambitious plans for the war which their party had been advocating for, in one shape or another, for much of the 1380s. Having removed de la Pole and others from the helm of state, Gloucester, Bolingbroke, and their allies found themselves confronted with exactly the same problem that the fallen Lord Chancellor had faced. There simply was not anywhere near enough money available to the English crown to conduct a large-scale military expedition into France. As a consequence, the government agreed in the autumn of 1388 to reopen peace talks with the French. And, for their part, the French were willing to countenance the same as their own young king Charles VI was showing signs of a severe mental illness and psychotic episodes which would plague his long 42-year rule. Consequently, a truce was signed in July 1389, promising an end to hostilities for 3 years and concluding the hostilities which had been occurring on the Iberian Peninsula for decades as an extension of the war. With a temporary cessation of the 100 Years' War entered into, the cause of much of the tension between Richard and his nobles was removed for the time being, and there were other developments at this time which allowed for the king and the Lords Appellant to make a clear break with the past. On the 3rd of May 1389, for instance, Richard, who was now 22 years of age, assumed full control of the government following his minority, and He used the occasion to make it clear to the political nation that he considered that the conflicts of the past were due to his having been poorly advised by de la Pole, de Vere, and others. Richard almost certainly did not believe this, but the pretense that he did allowed for political reconciliation in England. At roughly the same time, John of Gaunt returned to England after his 3 years in exile in Spain and France. For all that he has been presented as an overmighty lord who wished to usurp Richard in the past, John would act as a stabilizing influence in England in the years that followed, bridging the gap between the more radical elements within the Lords Appellant and Richard himself. His return, combined with these other changes, effectively ushered in a period of unprecedented stability during Richard's reign in the years that followed. The early and mid-1390s were the honeymoon period of Richard's reign, when some level of calm existed within England's own politics and the country's foreign relations were also inherently stable. It consequently allowed for the flourishing of late medieval English culture. It was between the late 1380s and 1400 that Geoffrey Chaucer, an individual who had sat in the wonderful Parliament in 1386 and who was subsequently appointed as Clerk of the King's Work in 1389, composed the Canterbury Tales, widely regarded as a foundational text in the formation of modern English literature. Richard, as well as John of Gaunt, continued to patronize Chaucer throughout the 1390s, and elsewhere Richard patronized numerous artists and writers. A notable example of this artistic work, which still survives today, is the Wilton Diptych, a two-hinged religious panel painting which is housed today in the National Gallery in London. It depicts Richard kneeling before the Virgin and Child while 3 English saints stand over him. The diptych is a striking example of late Gothic style on the cusp of the Renaissance. And from an architectural perspective, Richard was also active in the 1390s, commissioning the master mason Walter Walton to add extensive and elaborate new royal apartments onto Porchester Castle in Hampshire in the latter years of his reign. As much as the 1390s ushered in a period of relative stability during Richard's reign, the prospect of children with his first wife, Anne of Bohemia, was ended in June 1394 when Anne died quite suddenly. The cause was most likely the same bubonic plague which had carried off Richard's older brother more than 20 years earlier. Although the most catastrophic outbreak of the disease in the 1340s and 1350s was not repeated in later years, periodic outbreaks of the plague continued across Europe for decades and even centuries to come. Anne now fell foul of one such incident in the summer of 1394, and Richard was devastated. Theirs had been a relationship of genuine affection. So grief-stricken was the king that he ordered the demolition of Sheen Manor in Surrey, the place where she had died, and this possibly had graver consequences still for the reign and the realm. Historians have long speculated that Anne, as one of her husband's principal counsellors, had a moderating impact on Richard, and that her death in the summer of 1394 ushered in a new period of reckless and autocratic behaviour on the king's part. If this is so, her demise must be seen as a major factor in the deterioration of Richard's rule in the years that followed. For the time being, Richard simply sought to distract himself. Just weeks after his wife's death, he became the first English king in nearly 200 years to visit Ireland. Contingents of Cambro-Norman knights had first conquered much of Ireland for the English crown in the late 12th century, but the conquest had never been completed, with the Irish lords retaining control of large parts of West Ulster, Connacht, and parts of Munster and Leinster. No English king had visited the country since King John in 1210, and the advent of the 100 Years' War in France had seen the English lordship in Ireland starved of resources. As a result, during the 14th century, the Irish or Gaelic lords were resurgent, expanding westwards themselves to reconquer parts of the country which had been under English rule, notably East Ulster, where an earldom of Ulster had been created, but which was now restored to the rule of a branch of the O'Neills and other noble families there. All of the early indicators of Richard's reign had suggested that he had little interest in his Irish lordship, and in fact viewed the country solely as a political wilderness to which he could exile his enemies at home. But now, in 1394, he elected to undertake the first royal expedition to the country in over 170 years. This Irish sojourn would have interesting results. Richard landed near Waterford with an army of over 7,000 men in October 1394. He then campaigned primarily in Leinster and eastern Munster throughout the late autumn, winter and spring of 1395, principally against Art MacMurrough of southern Leinster, who had recently tried to reinitiate a claim to the Irish high kingship which had been dormant for several centuries. But this military activity was limited in range and effect. The real success of Richard's campaign lay in a series of treaties which he negotiated with some of the principal Irish lords, such as the great O'Neill of Tyrone in Ulster and the O'Briens of Thomond in the far west. These were effectively treaties whereby he attempted to recognise these Irish lords as English subjects if they promised to pay homage to him as Lord of Ireland. Political arrangements such as this would be tried decades later by the Tudors as part of their ultimately successful efforts to conquer Ireland, but it is noteworthy that Richard was employing this method much earlier in the late 14th century. This served to stabilise the political and military situation in Ireland somewhat in the mid-1390s, and with that done, Richard returned to England in May 1395. But it was not the last time he would set foot in Ireland, and the second visit would have greater political ramifications. Back at home, the major concern was with Richard's marital status and, of course, France. England needed time to restore its ability to pay for the wars on the continent, and France had to deal with a bitter civil war which was beginning over the issue of Charles VI's increasing bouts of mental illness. It seemed in 1395 that the two issues could be confronted simultaneously. A proposal had been put forward in 1393 to bring a more lasting conclusion to the 100 Years' War if the French agreed to acknowledge Richard as the ruler of Aquitaine in western France and also enlarge the size of that territory in return for Richard paying homage to Charles VI as his liege lord as King of France. But this latter stipulation, with its inference that the King of England was in some way a subject of the King of France, was politically unacceptable for the English government. Accordingly, new negotiations were entered into in the mid-1390s, whereby if the war could not be ended, it could at least be postponed for a very long time and in such a way that both monarchs could save face. By late 1395, the basis of a 28-year truce had been worked out, and the possibility of a sustained period of peace was on the horizon. As part of the proposed peace, it had been decided that Richard would also marry Isabella of Valois, the daughter of King Charles VI and Isabeau of Bavaria. There was just one problem with this. Isabella was only 6 years of age, while Richard was nearing his 30th year. Even by the standards of the time, Isabella's age and the idea that she would be sent to live in a foreign land while still just a child was viewed as being problematic and was discussed during the negotiations. For their part, many on the English side were conscious that the marriage would not be consummated for many years, and Isabella would not produce any children, and consequently an heir for Richard, for the better part of a decade at least. But in the end, the prospect of establishing a lasting peace between France and England after half a century of near-continuous warfare won out. Richard visited Paris in the autumn of 1396 to celebrate the union at the French court there, and days later, after returning to the English enclave at Calais, the wedding ceremony was performed on the 31st of October. The pair returned to England then, where Isabella was crowned as queen the following year and was established with her own household and governess at Windsor Castle. Thus, the unusual marriage had resulted in a temporary cessation to hostilities in the 100 Years' War, but the issue of the succession to Richard was left precariously unsettled. The establishment of a more sustained peace with France in 1396 has often been viewed as having instilled a new determination in Richard to consolidate his power at home and seek revenge on many of those who had tried to overrule him a decade earlier. If this was the case, he had been harbouring a grudge against figures such as his uncle, Thomas of Woodstock, for 8 years, and he was now determined to act on it. Beginning in early 1397, Richard became a far more forceful and autocratic ruler than he had been during the early and mid-1390s. Accordingly, he developed a new faction of close followers, much like that which had centred on de la Pole and de Vere in the 1380s. This new coterie of adherents included individuals like John and Thomas Holland, whom he honoured by promoting them to the titles of Duke of Exeter and Duke of Surrey, and Richard's first cousin, Edward of York, another grandson of Edward III. These and others were showered with new lands, titles and political offices in 1397 and 1398. Additionally, he began building up a new power base in Western England and Wales to act as a counterbalance to the financial power of London and its hinterland. Simultaneous with this advancement of his own followers, Richard moved against his enemies. On the 11th of July 1397, Thomas of Woodstock, 1st Duke of Gloucester, and several others who had acted with him in 1386 and 1387 were arrested. In the weeks that followed, their lands, offices, and titles were stripped from them, and it was these with which Richard rewarded his own followers in the months that followed. Trials followed from September 1397 onwards, and eventually several of the lords were convicted and executed. Others were simply executed without judicial procedure, as seems to have been the case with Gloucester, who was killed while imprisoned late in 1397. Then, to consolidate the situation, Richard had a new parliament convened at Shrewsbury. This was packed with his supporters, and during the course of 1398 it overturned much of the legislation and acts which had been passed through the Wonderful Parliament and the Merciless Parliament in 1386, 1387 and 1388. Moreover, the Parliament of Shrewsbury saw to it that power moving forward was far more consolidated in Richard and his faction's hands. Perhaps, given all this, there is little surprise that this period came to be known by near contemporaries as the Tyranny. What all of this amounted to was an effort by Richard to establish a much more powerful and absolutist kingship. Signs of this were evident at court, where more deferential forms of address, such as High Majesty, were now adopted when speaking to the king. But Richard had badly miscalculated. Absolutist monarchs would later manage to emerge in the 16th and 17th centuries in England, France, and elsewhere because these kings ran centralized states with a large taxation base that gave them the funding to be able to overawe their own nobles. This was most certainly not the case in 14th century England. The 100 Years' War had seen the crown desperately reliant on the nobility for funding and military contributions. As it did, the power of the nobility relative to the king had increased dramatically, such that historians have long spoken of the period as one of overmighty subjects and bastard feudalism, where the feudal order was compromised by certain lords becoming nearly as powerful as monarchs themselves. In this environment, Richard could not hope to impose the kind of absolutist kingship which he tried to without it garnering a major reaction from some of his nobles, and Richard would learn that fact very quickly. There were many threats still present for Richard even after the initial purges of 1397 and 1398. Principal amongst them was the Lancastrian royal line headed by John of Gaunt. John acted shrewdly and politically during the initial stages of the tyranny, not challenging the king and standing by while others, such as his brother Thomas, were effectively arrested and murdered by Richard. There was, after all, a possibility that he, or more likely his eldest son, Henry Bolingbroke, would ascend to the throne in the near future if Richard were to die without an heir. But Richard was alive to this possibility too, and when Bolingbroke ended up in a quarrel at court with the Duke of Norfolk, Richard took the opportunity to banish Henry from England. Bolingbroke headed for France, where he learned shortly afterwards that his father had died of seemingly natural causes in England on the 3rd of February 1399. Moreover, it was soon public knowledge that Richard had used John of Gaunt's death as an opportunity to fully disinherit Henry, stripping him of the vast Lancastrian estates in England. Henry was unwilling to accept this unchallenged, and by the spring of 1399 he was amassing a coalition of disaffected English nobles in exile in France with the intention of overthrowing Richard. Thus it was that Henry Bolingbroke, with a small group of followers, landed in Yorkshire in the summer of 1399. Bolingbroke's plans were aided by the fact that Richard had opportunely chosen this moment to depart once again for Ireland. Exactly why the king elected to undertake a second expedition to the country is a matter of debate. Conventionally, it has been assumed that he was unhappy with the Irish lords whom he had made agreements with 4 years earlier, and the fact that these agreements had not been honoured. However, a Welsh chronicler of the time, called Adam of Usk, suggests that Richard had intended to crown one of his rising court favourites, his nephew, Thomas Holland, 1st Duke of Surrey, as King of Ireland, and that in this capacity Holland would be installed in Dublin with the goal of reinvigorating crown rule in Ireland. We may never know what the actual purpose of Richard's second expedition was, but we do know how it played out. He landed at Waterford on the 1st of June 1399 with an army of approximately 3,000 men, but he would have quickly come to regret his decision as word reached Ireland of Bolingbroke's landing in England. As a result, Richard was no sooner arrived in Ireland than he was making plans for his departure. Consequently, he landed back in Wales on the 24th of July, just 7 weeks after reaching Ireland. It was a short but fateful trip which ensured that Bolingbroke's conspiracy was able to take effect in his absence. There was no real war to speak of between Richard and Henry in the end. After Henry had landed in Yorkshire, disaffected elements from all over northern England began rallying to his banner, while Richard had made the fatal error of bringing many of his key allies with him to Ireland, so that there was no concerted response to Bolingbroke's arrival within England. By the time Richard made landfall back in Wales, Henry had moved south towards London. His cause received a massive boost in late July when Edmund, Duke of York, the last living son of Edward III and the man whom Richard had appointed as Lord Protector of England while he was in Ireland, gathered an army to confront Henry and then changed his mind and instead sided with Bolingbroke. Given all this, it was clear to Richard within days of his return that his cause was doomed. Consequently, on the 19th of August, Richard surrendered to Bolingbroke at Flint Castle in Wales. 2 weeks later, when the party had returned to London, he was imprisoned in the Tower. Within less than 3 months, Richard's absolutist reign had been overthrown. It was a stunning turn of events. The question now was what would happen next. Henry had not launched his military campaign with a clear statement that he intended to usurp the throne from Richard and become king himself. Rather, he had presented himself as just a leading noble trying to bring an end to Richard's tyranny. But, however he presented himself in public, there is no doubt that by the time he brought Richard back to London, that he was determined to depose the king and have himself crowned as his successor. But this posed two problems. Firstly, a reasonable legal justification needed to be found for the removal of Richard from the throne. This would not go wanting, as the political community were willing to accept the idea that Richard's tyrannous behaviour alone in recent years was a suitable basis on which to depose him. However, the second issue was thornier. Henry was not the next in line to the throne. This distinction fell to Edmund de Mortimer, the 5th Earl of March, a great-grandson of Edward III, who was just 7 years old, but who had a better claim by right of his descent from Edward III's second oldest son, Lionel of Clarence, whereas Henry's right was as the son of the great king's third eldest son. However, this problem was rapidly overcome. Henry had been the one to overthrow Richard, and there was no appetite for another child king such as Richard had initially been in the late 1370s and 1380s. Accordingly, in haste, Richard was formally deposed on the 1st of October 1399, and Henry was crowned as King Henry IV of England less than 2 weeks later on the 13th of October. Henry would rule for 14 years, generally fighting off rebellions in Wales and elsewhere, while his son, Henry V, would rule for a brief few years thereafter, during a period in which he recommenced the 100 Years' War in France in a strikingly successful manner at the famous Battle of Agincourt. But Richard, who, it should be remembered, was still only 32 years of age at the time of his deposition, would not live to see any of these latter victories in France. In January 1400, a number of the lords and courtiers whom Richard had promoted in the late 1390s and who were not out of favour in England attempted an insurrection known as the Epiphany Rising, with the goal of killing Henry and setting Richard free to become king once again. Henry received news of it before the rising could be successfully implemented, but in the aftermath of the failed coup he was determined to ensure that no new rebellion could be launched on Richard's behalf. Accordingly, Richard was starved to death at Pontefract Castle in the first half of February 1400. He was buried shortly afterwards without great fanfare at King's Langley Priory, a Dominican priory in Hertfordshire. So died Richard II, but his usurpation by Bolingbroke and subsequent death had created a political uncertainty within England which few can have imagined having the consequences which it would in years to come. The removal of Richard and the accession of Henry IV had opened the possibility that rival claimants to the throne, descended from the myriad family lines of Edward III's children, could press their own claims to the throne, and that possibility was not easily done away with once it had been employed once. Thus, when Henry IV's grandson, Henry VI, proved to be unfit to rule and often mentally incapacitated, then another great-grandson of Edward III's through his fourth son Edmund began to press a claim to the throne in the 1450s. This was Richard, Duke of York, whose son Edward would eventually rule England as Edward IV. Thus, the autocracy of Richard III had created a situation whereby rival claims to the English throne could be pressed. Consequently, while the most intense period of the Wars of the Roses lies between the 1450s and the 1480s, many historians have suggested that its roots can actually be traced to the political crisis Richard created in the 1390s. In this way, Richard's actions in the last years of his rule might be viewed as the root of the Wars of the Roses. Richard II was one of England's most complex kings. In many ways, he was a victim of his circumstances. He somewhat unexpectedly ascended to the throne when he was just 10 years of age in 1377, owing to the premature deaths of both his father and older brother in the few years before the eventual death of Edward III. As a result, Richard's reign was substantially shaped by the individuals around him, while he himself was continuing to grow into an adult in the late 1370s and early 1380s. Already, before he could rule for himself, multiple crises had developed in his dominions, notably the Peasants Revolt in 1381, owing to excessive levels of taxation to pay for the war with France, the spread of the Lollard heresy preached by John Wycliffe, and the drastic setbacks in the 100 Years' War. Consequently, there was little that he could do to remedy the situation when he began to take a more activist role in ruling England himself in the mid-1380s. And this point was proved when the Lords Appellant managed to remove Richard's advisors and seize power in England themselves briefly in the late 1380s. They had called for a more aggressive approach to the war for years, but when they were provided with the opportunity to do so, they too could not figure out how to finance it, and eventually a temporary cessation of hostilities with France was agreed in 1389. These qualifications aside, there is no doubting that Richard was responsible for the deterioration in his kingdom in the late 1390s. After several years of stability in the early and mid-1390s, he elected from 1397 onwards to begin moving against several of those lords who had challenged his authority years earlier. At this point, Richard attempted to effectively introduce a species of absolute monarchy, one in which the power of the king could be unchallenged by his nobility. In doing so, he set off a new political crisis in England, one which eventually saw opposition coalesce around his first cousin, Henry Bolingbroke. In the course of just a few short months in 1399, Henry seized power, deposed his cousin, and proclaimed himself as King Henry IV. In these events lay some of the origins of the Wars of the Roses, which would destabilize England for much of the 15th century. Richard was responsible for this insofar as he misjudged the extent of his power. Had he lived in the 17th century and been the ruler of a centralized, early modern bureaucratic state, he might well have been able to exercise the brand of absolutism which he attempted to impose from 1397 onwards. But this was the late Middle Ages, and any king still had to appease his feudal lords. Richard failed to recognize that, and it was ultimately his downfall and the beginning of much strife in England. What do you think of King Richard II? Was he a very poor monarch who was responsible for igniting the Wars of the Roses, or was he a victim of circumstance, one whose reign largely played out while he was still a child and a teenager? Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
Hello guys, the People Profiles and the History Chronicles have joined forces, so as well as the fantastic long-form documentaries you get here on the People Profiles, the team are also producing short-form documentaries on the History Chronicles, on everything from knightly orders to the Battle of the Little Bighorn, as well as a range of biographies from history's best, worst and most interesting people. Check out the link in the video description, subscribe, and thanks for watching.